Hi, we enter into the story of the 10 lepers, one of whom returns to give glory to God and thanks to Jesus in Luke 17:11 and what follows. If you haven't watched the video I posted last time, the introduction to this unit, 1711 to 1948, I strongly encourage you to do that. We went over, among other things, some of the faulty presuppositions that we'll see throughout this unit, and we'll be looking at those more as we go, and also this shape of the whole unit around the theme of rejection. And that's going to be set up right here at the beginning, when this story, I'd like to suggest, is programmatic for the whole unit for a number of reasons. One of which is it's the first time, as you can see on the left side of the screen in the first verse 11 here, the first geographic reference to any place that Jesus has been since the very beginning of the travel narrative back in 951. We've seen references to generic things like a certain place, or he entered a village, or he came into a Pharisee's house, but there have been no geographic references whatsoever. And not only that, this story of 10 lepers who are healed, or actually 10 lepers who are cleansed, but only one who recognizes it in terms of healing. And that's really, I should correct this in this description on the right side to make that technically right there. But it's generally seen as 10 lepers healed, even though that's not exactly what it says, as we'll see. But the fact that 9 don't come back and Jesus asks it as a rhetorical question sets up, I'd suggest, this theme for the entire unit here, that whether it's the poor as you see in the green, or the elite you see in the purple, or the disciples you see in the blue, Jesus is going to largely be rejected at every level of society, leading of course to what we know is happening, his crucifixion by the Romans, and eventual his resurrection by God. And so that's the context in which we're looking at this. And focusing on the faulty presuppositions, one of those is that these passages should be read on their own rather than parallel to their chiastic partners in the overall journey to Jerusalem chiasm. But interestingly, our current passage doesn't have as clear a connection as we can see here from 1711 back to this casting out Satan there. And this section was about casting out demons and the question of what authority Jesus had for it. And here, Jesus' authority isn't at issue. What's at issue is the response to Jesus. We've seen Jesus' authority at issue in the earlier part of the travel narrative, but now that's not really the question. The real question is how do people respond to what Jesus offers at various branches of society. So in terms of what we're seeing here, actually looking at the story, let's look at our first verse, then we'll look at the geography a little bit. So on the way to Jerusalem, which is already misleading here, the Greek has kai enigneto and to, literally, and it was that in, hence translated by some, and it happened that while traveling, or it came to pass as he went. But it doesn't say on the way, and that's important because the way, hodos in Greek, means the road, but also the way, and in Acts is capital W in most translations to highlight it means the way of Jesus, not just the road, literal road. But that's not the language that's being used here. But it's to highlight that they're going to Jerusalem, which they've been going to since 951, and as my note below has, and as you can see from the chart on the right, it was mentioned at the very center of the chiasm when Jesus lamented over it when he was far from it. But when we look at the map, we'll realize he hasn't really gone anywhere according to the story here. There is no actual border between Samaria and Galilee. We need to look at the language more closely. There is no word for region in the Greek, but he was going through the midst of Samaria and Galilee. And although the map on the right seems to over-determine the idea of boundaries as if they were modern countries, which they certainly were not, here we can express that the river provides a natural boundary, but these color coordinations make it look much sharper than it really was in real life. So it's suggesting he's between Samaria and Galilee, but we saw in 951, right after that, he sent the disciples into a village of Samaria where they were rejected because he was going to Jerusalem. So this is where they were in chapter 9, and this seems to be where they are now, even though in 2 chapters they're going to make it all the way down here into Jerusalem. So geography has not been important for Luke throughout the travel narrative. It's just been that he's on the way to Jerusalem and that he's teaching along the way. But now as we reach near the end of it, the geography is important, and the idea that Jerusalem is in sight, even though it's not literally in sight, is what's important here. So we'll leave that up just for a moment. We note that Galilee has not been mentioned all the way back since 826. We saw Galileans mentioned in a story Jesus told in comparison about the Galileans whose blood Pilate mingled with the sacrifices, but neither Galilee as a geography or Galileans as people were directly in the story. So this is a reference to recall Samaria, of course, and we'll see, as you can see right now in verse 16, that the one who returns in the second half of the story here is in fact a Samaritan. and the opposite of what we saw in the story in 952 and following, where the Samaritans reject Jesus. Now one comes to him. So let's look at our story a little more closely, and we'll see a number of other links that connect this story, not just with chiastic partners, but with other healing stories and other stories that are coming up as we go. So, and verse 12 here, my note below has what I was just saying about the chiastic parallel. But here I'd like to share this note here from Neville, who had a nice article from 2020, as you can see on this passage. He says, although routinely read as an exemplary story of gratitude, which certainly features in Luke's account, to focus on thankfulness in 17:11 and 19 without first appreciating the ominousness of the narrator's reminder about Jesus' movement toward Jerusalem is to overlook a crucial dimension of this episode. Traveling toward his own betrayal, shame, suffering, and death, Jesus paused to alleviate the illness and social isolation of 10 leprous men who had the audacity to appeal for aid. And I think that's really important to see, because that's just another element of why we need to see this story as Neville highlights, in its narrative context, not just as a freestanding story. So in a moment, we'll look how it echoes other leper stories, and how the scene also echoes two other healing stories. But most immediately, it's following from the narrator's introduction here into this approach to Jerusalem. So notice, as he entered, where's everybody else? Throughout the travel narrative, we've seen crowds, we've seen Pharisees, and we've seen disciples, all as companions on the way. But notice, it seems like they're not here. Verse 11 says Jesus is going through between, and it's as if the disciples have just completely disappeared from the scene, as well as the crowd and the Pharisees. So that's certainly a narrative device by the author here, rather than expect that literally they've all disappeared, but it helps us to isolate the scene to Jesus and the 10. So he entered a village, and as a number of scholars note, and as my note below has, there's an enormous amount of movement in this story, and that has a lot to do with how lepers were isolated, literally marginalized, put on the margins of society. And so you can see below the sequence of those. He enters the village here, they keep their distance, he tells them to go show themselves to the priest, and they went. One of them turns back, and he tells that one to get up and go on the way. So movement to and from Jesus throughout, and we'll see how that echoes other movements in terms of cleanliness and connection with Jesus. So he entered a village. The last village we saw is at 13:22, but it was a Samaritan village that the disciples entered into that rejected them back in chapter 9. And then we hear 10 lepers. As Tannehill notes, they're representative of the whole human race, and that may well be. But as 10, they form an interesting contrast with the 10 slaves sent out in 1912. And I don't want to get into that story in detail now. It'll make more sense to do the comparison once we've been through this and when we get there. But just to highlight for the moment, these are 10 lepers, 10 members of the marginalized of society that come toward Jesus and then return to Jesus with glory to God. One of them does, with glory to God, as opposed to 10 slaves of a wealthy member of the elite who return with more money, and the one who doesn't is ordered to be slaughtered. So quite a contrast there, and it'll really highlight how the radical misreading of that story is if Jesus was the nobleman calling for the slaughter of his enemies. Nothing could be farther from how Jesus is reported as shown in Luke, especially since he explicitly says to love your enemies. So we'll see that as we go. So 10 lepers, and we saw lepers back in 5:12, and it's worth looking back. They're mentioned in 7:22, worth looking at that for a moment, where the disciples of John the Baptist sent to Jesus to find out if he is the one. And he responds, go and tell John what you've seen and heard. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, the poor have good news brought to them. So lepers are cleansed is certainly echoed into our passage here. But we already saw it back in 5:12 to 14. Worth looking at back there too, because there's some other similarities. This is where a man's covered with leprosy, and again he bows with his face to the ground. The one in our current scene will fall at Jesus' feet, and comes up and asks Jesus if he can make him clean, and he does, and Jesus will tell him to go and show yourself to the priest, and we'll see the exact same thing in our passage here. But there's also the reference back to Luke 4:27 in his initial inaugural sermon in Nazareth, when he suggests that the Nazareans want him to be their hometown boy and are jealous of what he did in Capernaum. And he uses an example of Naaman the Syrian being healed from leprosy. leprosy, a story from 2 Kings 5. And we note this in Naaman's response in 5:15 in 2 Kings. Then he returned to the man of God, he and all his company. He came and stood before them and said, "Now I know that there is no God in all the earth except in Israel. Please accept a present from your servant." And the man of God will not accept the present because he doesn't want to look like he's a mercenary healing for the sake of pay. But certainly the point that Naaman's making is not that he wants to pay him off, but he's using money as a form of offering thanksgiving and gratitude. And so we saw that in the story Jesus told back in chapter 4, now it's echoing all the way here to chapter 17. So 10 lepers approached him, and as we already saw from the quote from Neville, that's a bold act on their part to come up to Jesus in this village. And we don't know anything else about the scene. The image here from Tissot gives us some sense of it, but Luke does not provide a lot of detail to know where are the rest of the villagers and where are they in the village. They certainly would not be as a group in the center of the village, but Luke doesn't say. But it says keeping their distance, or literally, as you can see from the note below, anastasin porothen, they stood up from afar. And as my note below has, another border signal suggesting the mixed feelings of lepers. So they're standing up is suggesting coming to Jesus, but they're still from afar. So we see other examples of desiring healings but recognizing uncleanness. The rich man distance from Lazarus, the Pharisee from the tax collector coming up, and Peter and the woman following at a distance, we'll see in the Passion story later. As Marshall notes below, the lepers were conforming to the law by avoiding physical contacts with other people according to Leviticus and Numbers, but staying close to habitations so they might receive charitable gifts. And that may be, although the text doesn't say that specifically. So they called out, literally they took up voice, and the word phone for voice here in Luke expresses the competing attempts of God and demons to be heard. And I won't go through all of these here, but you can see them and go through them for yourself if you want, as we hear opposite points. And we'll certainly see more people calling out in favor of Jesus, but we've also seen demon voices calling out as well. And they say Jesus, and we note how few characters refer to Jesus out loud, but we'll see the same thing in 1838 from the blind man on the side of the road. But he'll respond, Son of David. Here it's Jesus, Master, epistata, not Kyrios, that's sometimes translated Lord, but Master here. All the previous uses of referring to Jesus with this term are by the disciples. That's setting up these lepers to be potential disciples. Notice they don't call him teacher, as the scribes and the elite often do. They're not concerned with his teaching. What they're looking for is mercy, as we can see here. And this is the first direct link between mercy and Jesus, and again, we'll see it in the blind person story in the very next chapter. And as my note below has, the link between mercy and alms, you notice that Elio, the linked prefix here in alms and the word for mercy there in Greek, may be expecting no more than the usual alms from a passing person of compassion and address Jesus as such in order to honor him in hope of a reward. So it might be simply that, just like beggars trying to express honor to someone from whom they want something, that they just want money. But that's not what happens, of course. And so we see this here. And my note below note that the healing is done without any word from Jesus or physical contact with the lepers, in contrast to the one we saw in 5:12, where he reaches out and touches him. And we'll note the parallel between his seeing here and the one who's healed seeing here. So when he saw them, kai idon, it could be, and behold, he said to them, but it also can be translated here as saw them. And I think that's nice here because it matches what we see here. So he said to them collectively, go, as it was in verse 11, that he was going through the village, and show yourselves to the priest, a precise repeat of 5:14, as I was just noting. And we'll note that priests in Luke have only been in the story as someone referred to rather than live, except for all the way back in 1:5. And after this, as you can see from 1947 on, will simply be the high or chief priest, same word, arche, for either high or chief, and that's who we'll see as a group. So there actually are no literal priests in the story before this other than back in verse 5, all the way at the beginning. And as they went, they were made clean. So in the process of going, notice it doesn't say they got to the priest. It doesn't say how far they went, and there's no sense of having gotten very far at all. But in the process of going, they were made clean. And one thing that's going to be important here is the relationship between being made clean, which Jesus has done, and seeing that they are healed. And that's what will happen in the next scene. And this is where Geiser can help us in this little chart, copied from his article, that we can see what he sets as part 1 and part 2, shifting here in verse 15 when the focus goes from the 10 to the 1. So we can see the other examples of being made clean. The 1139 is the only one that wasn't for lepers, all these passages that I've referred to already. So, and this is the second half, as I noted. So when he saw that he was healed, and that's a key point here. It's Idon again, just like it was for Jesus here. So it could be, and behold, he was healed, but clearly it's meant to suggest his perspective, because this is what follows. When he saw that he was healed. And language for healing here, Iome, makes us look at, or invites us to look at least the language of healing in Luke that we've seen before, using these 3 different words. And another one will be taken up later, sozo, which is to save or to heal. But we'll see it there where Jesus says your faith has sozoed you, so to speak. We've also seen cure, therapeuo, from which we obviously get the English word therapy or therapeutic, which relates directly to health, although it comes from a sense of rendering service, especially to the gods. But here is healing, which is, and I put heal/cure because scholars note that there's not a sharp line. But in the narrative context that we're seeing here, the cleanliness is suggesting that the actual ailment has gone away, that something physical has happened to them. But healing here, and the form of iomai here, has to do with the state of one's relationship with others. So it's different than curing. It's different than the biological element. It's the element in which one feels better about oneself in relation to society and others. And so we've seen healing throughout, but we also will see a couple interesting parallels between this as a healing and what we see that follows from 2 other stories elsewhere in Luke that we've seen. So when he saw that he was healed, not that he was cleansed, but he was healed, he turned back toward Jesus, but it could also be a turning back toward God. And we'll see how that plays off against the opposite in the very next scene, Lot's wife turning back when she shouldn't have been turning back, matching the shepherds all the way back in 2:20. Praising is a bad translation here for doxazon, which is glorifying. It's not that glorifying isn't praising, but it's a particular word, and we've seen it a number of times here, so many times. Geiser notes that this praise and the thanks in verse 16, quote, appear to be equivalent acts, and yet they're both listed there, and there are some differences. Because glorifying God can happen by anybody, but the word for thanks has a particular context here in the patronage system. So we'll look at that in a second. So glorifying God with a loud voice, and we see a number of loud voices in Luke, and again, for the sake of time, I won't go over all of them, but you can see they occur for various reasons there. And I already noted phone. So here we see the focus on this one person. Vincent suggests, just as the Good Samaritan in chapter 10 is a Christ figure, so the Samaritan leper is a church figure embodying the essential elements of Christian worship. And it may be, although worship is not exactly the theme here, it's more simply the response. And to the extent that worship is a response to what people are grateful for to God, or what people want God to do for them, that certainly makes sense. Although worship usually involves multiple people, and this is obviously just an individual. So he prostrated, or literally fell on his face, and it's actually not the normal word for prostration. It's literally that he fell on his face at Jesus' feet. And that shows a link between 2 other stories: the woman of the city who's at Jesus' feet, and the story of the 2 daughters, Jairus and the woman of the city who falls at Jairus, who falls at Jesus' feet. And we'll see there's as you can see here, a similar ending between them. Go, your faith has healed you or saved you. So interesting way that Luke is suggesting that we listen to all 3 of those stories together. The story of a woman who's made suspect in the minds of Simon the Pharisee, and Jairus, the important synagogue leader, who's desperate and turns to Jesus when his daughter is near death, and then the leper here. And thanked him, using Eucharistio here for the first time. And we'll see it in 18:11, and then it's just at the Last Supper and Acts when Paul recalls it in the same context of offering thanks for breaking of bread. And this is where we need to recognize that offering thanks means an inability to reciprocate. So in the reciprocity code, as we saw earlier around meal situations, when someone invites you for a meal, you're supposed to invite them back. If someone gives you something, you're supposed to give them something back. But one cannot give back to God what God gives to us, so recognizing the cycle of reciprocity has to be broken. Thanks is offered in replace for reciprocity. And that's the basis of the patronage code, where clients cannot respond to wealthy and elite patrons by giving the kind of access to status and wealth that the patron already has, but they can give thanks and praise to the patron. So that's what's being done here. The leper can't give Jesus anything, but he offers thanks to acknowledge that he can't directly repay. And then the narrator adds in the wonderful kind of suspense that's revealed here, a twist. He's a Samaritan. And we hadn't known that till now. So now we recognize he's doubly marginalized. Or we might suggest in modern language as intersectional oppressions between both being a leper and being a Samaritan here. And we've already seen a good Samaritan, of course, but as I've noted, we already saw a Samaritan village that rejected Jesus here. Let's go down just to see the end of our passage before we finish here, already going a little long. So Jesus asked, to whom? Certainly to us as an audience, because as I've been highlighting, there's nobody else apparently there in the story. We're not 10 made clean. Notice he doesn't say we're 10 healed. He says we're not 10 made clean. And if they came back, then they could have seen that they were healed, but they didn't see that. But the other 9, where are they? And that's where I'm suggesting this sets up the theme for the shape of this here. That even amongst the poor, they wanted what they want, but they don't see what's happening. They've experienced the cleanliness, but they don't interpret it through the eyes of faith to see they've been healed. That Jesus has more than simply the power to remove a physical ailment, but to restore the social fabric where it's been torn. And he asks us rhetorically, and we don't know. Did they just go on to the priests? As it says, as they went, they were made clean, but only one turned back. So it suggests they just went on and didn't come back. Maybe they were going to come back later. We don't know. We never see them again. And this is how he continues, asking another rhetorical question. Was none found? Bringing up, we've seen the lost and found theme, whether it was the coin or the sheep or the son. None of them was found, suggesting that although they were made clean, they are still lost because they haven't come to Jesus and rejected the way that he's opposing of Rome that's about to reject him. To return here, echoing verse 15, what the one did, and give glory to God, except this foreigner. Allogenes, used only here in the New Testament, and as Marshall notes, used of non-Jews in the Septuagint on the well-known keep out signs and the inner barrier of the temple. And as my note below has, from Chalmers, epigraphic evidence even demonstrates that allogenes was part of a vocabulary that governed admission to the Jerusalem temple. At least 2 Herodian period inscriptions demanded that no allogenes enter the interior balustrades or enclosure of the Jerusalem temple under pain of death. As Boehm explores at length, allogenes has a wide range of meanings in Septuagintal and Second Temple Greek, and some of these meanings include ethnic or moral difference. So Jesus bringing this rhetorical question up, and of course reminding us of the Nazarenes' rejection of Jesus back in chapter 4, when he said that God had as much concern for a foreigner as for them, is reminding us of one of the reasons why Jesus will be rejected. And we know how even in our time today, when I'm making this video, the idea of including foreigners leads many people who claim to be Christians to reject those who don't want to include people who are, quote, not us. But those are just rhetorical questions here. There is no answer. So then he says to him, get up and go on your way, as in the prodigal son soliloquy that he tells himself to get up and go. And anastemi, its most immediate surrounding use, is about resurrection. So in many ways, the leper returns as a little death and resurrection story. In the face of rejection, symbolized by the 9 who don't return to Jesus, this one who does return recognizes that he's not only been cleansed but healed, and now having been recovered from the social death of being a leper, is now raised into new life. And Jesus summarizes here by saying, your faith has made you well or saved you, which is also the link between the 2 other healing stories that I've seen here. So 3 stories of people whose faith has healed them, and that will be the question, because we'll see coming up very soon, Jesus will ask, when the human one returns, will he find faith on the earth? See you next time when we hear a Pharisee ask about where the kingdom of God can be found. See you then. Bye-bye.